Hello, Agent of History here. Welcome. If you've watched the first video, An Invitation to a Journey, and you're back, I'm very, very grateful. If you haven't watched that first video, it doesn't matter. I'm going to set out here the nature of the journey that I'm inviting you on, which is a journey of two questions. How did we break and how do we heal? And here I'm going to offer some very, very basic initial answers in a framework I call spiritual materialism. And I just want to give it that name for myself, really. The name really expresses this fusion of politics and spirituality that I'm going to argue is just so essential if we're serious about understanding what's gone wrong and how to make it good. And the reason I believe this fusion is so essential is because if we think about the world today as a world characterized tragically by such violence, then I'm arguing that the fundamental cause of this violence, or the fundamental source of this violence, is in our dualistic consciousness, which is a fancy way of basically saying that we experience and therefore create a world of separation, me versus you, them versus us, in all of the structural, systemic ways that we know too well. So it follows then that if we want to end violence, we need to raise our consciousness to experience and create a world of non-duality, of an ultimate oneness. Yes, of course, we're still separate individuals, but ultimately we experience the world as oneness, that we are all one. Now, does it follow that all we need to do then is just take the kind of spiritualist approach and just meditate? As we meditate long and hard enough, we'll awaken to the illusion of our separation and we'll end violence and embrace love. Unfortunately, I don't think it's that simple. It's not that simple because we are in a material reality. So if you take a look at this slide I've put together, consciousness or spirit comes into our world, our material world, in a body. And so matter matters, and we need to understand, therefore, what I call here the relations of life reproduction. In other words, the systems by which our society is reproducing itself, and life now on a planetary scale is reproducing itself according to these violent systems, these dualistic systems, capitalism, patriarchy, racism, and I kind of bring them all in to I call it colonialism as a world historical dualistic system. So matter matters, and let me give you a really stark example of what I mean. So if we expect somebody who's poor, hungry, cold, overworked, stressed out to undertake an intensive daily practice of meditation, then obviously we're very naive. And of course, those are the conditions under which the vast majority of humanity now lives. So we need to really understand theoretically and practically the world that we're living in, the systems that we are part of and are reproducing on a material level. But also we need to understand that however concretely material the problem seems, poverty, homelessness, ecological destruction, ultimately it comes from the nature of the relations between us and the dualistic nature, the violent, separated, alienated nature of those relations. So from that perspective, we can now reframe that first question of how did we break to ask, what is it about our evolutionary journey that has led to this break from a situation of an initial kind of non-dual experience, a bit like how a baby comes into the world without any real sense of separation of itself from its others around it, to this situation today where we have obviously profound brokenness on this material and relational level. So from this perspective, we can rephrase that first question of how did we break to ask, what is it about our evolutionary journey that has led us from this initial state of non-duality, a bit like how a baby comes into the world without any real sense of separation from itself, from everything and everyone around it, to this increasingly broken, separated, alienated experience and creation of reality that characterizes our world today. Now, that is an extremely difficult question to answer and a complex one, and that's precisely what we'll be exploring on this journey. Suffice to say, however, at this initial stage, as we set out on our journey, we can identify that our evolutionary journey is made up of these three interacting elements, kind of pushing our evolution forward: life, environment, and technology, or human beings, or workers, objects and tools. So what I mean is you have a human being or a community of human beings, the workers, and they are manipulating their environment through the use of tools, through the use of technology, to produce objects that to satisfy their needs in order to survive at a minimum, and hopefully to flourish and thrive. So we can ask then, what is it about this interaction, this trialectic, I call it, this interaction between these three elements that has led to this shift from non-dual to dualistic consciousness? And here I need to bring in this concept of objectification. And by objectification, I mean two things. And these two elements of objectification, I think, are at the heart of this contradiction that has, been at the heart of our downfall in a really fundamental way. So the first understanding of conceptualization is a Marxist idea that we have ideas, and that through our bodies, through our work, we bring these ideas into our material reality as objects. Now, that is wonderful. That process over the millennia has led us to develop our cognitive abilities, our language, and therefore our abilities to communicate, and therefore our abilities to cooperate, and our abilities to imagine, and ultimately our capacity for freedom itself. However, at the same time, it has led to this second understanding and practice of objectification, which comes from a more feminist and decolonial understanding, which is that when I see you not as another human being or as another expression of life in any of its forms, I see you instead as an object for me to manipulate or control or use and abuse or violate or transgress in any violent way. And of course, and in that sense, that's an objectification of you. And in that sense, that is at the heart of violence, and is pretty much the definition of a dualistic consciousness. So with that in mind, what we can see here, and feel free to pause the video if you want to check this out in more detail, is essentially we have the ego's development, or the ego's development of its selective capacity. In other words, it's our abilities to use our minds to do all wonderful creative things and develop more and more complex ways by which we are growing our society, becoming more complex, achieving at least the capacity, at least, to achieve all of our needs. And at the same time, in this process, the mind begins to imagine the world as out there rather than created within, and starts to externalize reality, and starts to believe that the mind is sovereign, and it separates itself from the rest of the body, and we separate ourselves from each other on an individual level, on a group level, tribal level, national level, and so on and so forth. And the ultimate story, the ultimate trajectory of this evolutionary journey is one that starts with simplicity and stability, and is going to ever more complexity and ever more instability. And that is at the heart, or that is the product of what I call the evolutionary contradiction between the development of the ego's freedom or capacity for freedom, and what we really have is alienation and violence. So at this stage, I really need to make explicit a very grave danger, and that danger is that I take the particular historical trajectory of powerful white European or Western men and impose that as the universal experience of humanity, and that is colonialist violence. And as a white man in particular, I need to make this categorically explicit that that's not what I'm interested in doing whatsoever. I recognize the differences. I recognize that the most profound violence has emerged from cultures that I grew up in through Western colonialist projects that has wrought unimaginable violence right across the world. I recognize that I need to learn from indigenous peoples who maintain non-dual wisdoms and practices. I recognize all of this, and this journey is about opening my heart, my mind, and every part of me to this learning. At the same time, I will insist that we are one, that ultimately humanity is one. And we can see this in the work, for example, of someone like Joseph Campbell, who looked at the mythologies of people right across the world, and we see a common story that in so many different symbolic ways expresses the break that I'm talking about exactly here. So the initial basic answer to the first question of how did we break is something like we broke through an evolutionary process involving life, environment, and technology, by which we were able to objectify in a great way by developing our cognitive powers, our capacity for collaboration, cooperation, freedom, in order to produce the objects we need to survive and to thrive. But at the same time, in the same process, we came to, by using our mind so much, to kind of install the mind as sovereign, separate our mind from our bodies, separate ourselves from each other, and externalize reality, make reality as something that existed out there, and in that process start to come to see others, other life forms, human and non-human, as objects to manipulate. So hence this emergence of dualistic consciousness and the violence that characterizes so tragically the world that we experience and create today. So if that's the answer to the first question, what's the answer to the second question? How do we heal? Well, again, that's the journey we're going on to try to explore this very complex and beautiful question. But what we can say for now is, if the process of breaking was a process of forgetting, then the process of healing is a process of remembering, not just intellectually, not just cognitively, but coming back into our bodies to re-experience, to reawaken to the true nature of ourselves as consciousness, experiencing itself through this material reality, as ultimately as being divine, as having as remembering that reality is not something that's out there, but it's something that we collectively produce from moment to moment, and realizing therefore that we have these incredible powers of creation and transformation. So on a practical level, if we're really serious about addressing, overcoming, transforming the problems we face, then we need to design approaches that don't just focus on raising consciousness with a small c, political consciousness, i.e. the understanding of who we are in the context of our society and our history, but consciousness with a big C too, bringing people together in ever deeper, through relational work, in ever deeper states of consciousness that approximate towards the fundamental nature of reality as oneness, as unity. And I think that's why we see in all of the cutting edge, what we could call social technologies that people and organizations are developing to explore processes of transformation and approaches to transformation, we see at the heart of it this relationality, this relational work that is addressed not just at problem solving, but actually addressing how we transform ourselves and our relations behind those problems that cause those problems. So I kind of put this together, which is what in critical pedagogy terms is called a praxis, which is basically an unending cycle of what is traditionally thought and action. We think about something, we take an action, we reflect, we act again, we reflect, we act again. But here I call it an evolutionary practice, because it's not just about raising thought, in other words, our intellectual cognitive functions, but it's consciousness itself, awareness itself. So it takes an evolutionary element. So I call it these new 3 R's, rather than reading, writing, arithmetic. But there are 6 R's, but there are 3 at the heart. So all of these cutting edge technologies seem to have this going on, which is we begin with reconnection. We come into our bodies, we reintegrate our mind with all of the ways of knowing within us, to become fully present to who we are, where we are, and what's going on for us in the present moment. We can then come out to share that experience with others, and also be present to them in their sharing. And this creates a profound connection. Now, the next step, if that's done not so right, but done at sufficient depth, it creates an experience of a revelation. Information comes to us, which could be as a flash in our consciousness, words, images, whatever it is. There is information that comes to us that we need to act on. So we act, we respond, we have a response, to which we then reflect, and then we repeat the cycle again. So I see this as really at the heart of all of these cutting edge approaches to transformation that are emerging and proliferating today. Another way of saying kind of raising consciousness with a small and big C is waking up and waking down. So we're not just waking up to the nature of the political nature of our reality, the systems that we are living in and reproducing and are part of, but also we're waking down, we're coming into our bodies, again, so that we are coming into a state of presence and awareness itself. So that again is a very, very basic initial answer or response to this question: how do we heal? And the journey from now really begins through two particular elements. Number one, I'm going to be handing over to people who really know what they talk about through interviews, guides to the terrain that we're going to kind of explore together, and that will be available through videos here as well as podcast. And the second thing is I'm going to make videos that kind of applies this spiritual materialist framework to explore kind of key issues and problems that we face, to try to show you how it is that I believe this is a really essential combination of kind of spirituality or consciousness and politics. So that's it for now. I'm new to this. I'll take any feedback that is constructive. Please subscribe if you like what you're doing. Agentofhistory.com is the website. You can get in touch with me there. I'm open to absolutely. I'm here to learn, not here just to teach. So I really appreciate your time and your attention, and thank you so much for watching this.